Thank you, everyone, for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on what does the coronavirus recession mean for school finance. I'm Lori Crouch, EWA's Assistant Director. Please note that GoToWebinar is having a video issue right now, so we will hold this webinar without video. So don't think that there's something wrong with your computer. With that, I want to introduce today's moderator, Kevin Monken of the 74, and I'll turn it over to Kevin. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Lori, and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us. Thank you very much for joining. As Lori said, the webinar is titled, "What does the coronavirus recession mean for school finance?" She also said, I'm Kevin Mencken. I write for the 74. I have written, especially lately, a couple of finance stories for the 74. And here in the introductory remarks that I wrote, I included a joke about being in obvious need of a haircut right now, but I don't think that joke still applies. So you'll have to forgive me. So with that, school finance issues, which we're going to be talking about today, they can make for some of the more contentious conversations in ed policy, but they can also make for some of the most bloodless reporting. And if you're reporting on the federal budget, as I have, or maybe a local tax override, as I have, it can be a big challenge, not just to do the reporting and to delve into the minutia of the district ledgers, but you've also got to translate the details of the figures that you find in those ledgers to your readers, and you have to explain why they matter. And as somebody who's written his share of funding stories, especially over the last couple of weeks, I've really known that there's kind of a struggle in balancing your commitment to finely hewn detail in reporting, and you balance that with the needs of good narrative. So right now, as we speak, America's schools and districts are going through certainly the deepest financial crisis in a decade, and possibly the deepest in our lifetimes. And many of us have been focusing our attention for the last few months on the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, very understandably, but this massive social shutdown that pandemic has spawned is threatening to just lay waste to school spending to a degree that we really haven't seen since the Great Recession. And you've seen that reporters in states that were announcing really big teacher pay increases just a few months ago, they're now agonizing over where they can make cuts and economize because revenues from state sales and income taxes have just fallen through the floor. Today's release of new unemployment claims that you may have seen show that over the last 4 weeks, the US has shed 22 million jobs, which is roughly the entire net number of jobs that we created over the last decade. And on Tuesday, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities released sort of a white paper that I encourage you guys all to look at on the likely financial effects of this coronavirus shutdown, okay? They're predicting that the budgetary shortfalls could total as much as $500 billion for states over the next fiscal year, which in some instances is going to be the biggest ever. And sectors of the service economy that these states have really relied on, gaming, hospitality, travel, public transit, are projected to see hits of up to 90% over the next few months. So today we're going to talk about the impact of that financial blow on school finance. And with the prospect of these really severe funding reductions at the state level, school and district leaders are going to have to navigate this period into some tough choices. And a bunch of social science research conducted over the last couple of years has suggested that significant cuts to school resources during the Great Recession had really sizable negative effects on student outcomes. It's also the case that this abrupt fiscal uncertainty we're experiencing is going to interact with existing local financial issues, really complex ones like pensions and benefits. So we're hoping that this talk is going to guide reporters as they cover some fairly daunting technical issues over the next few months. And we're hoping that we can foster some discussion among the audience and among our panelists about how to tell what can be a very tough story in a really compelling way. So for that discussion, I'm being joined by two wonderful guests this afternoon. Michael Griffith is an independent school finance consultant who is soon to join the staff of the Learning Policy Institute next week. Congratulations, Michael. He also served as a school finance analyst and strategist at the Education Commission of the states. Karen Hawley-Miles is president and executive director of Education Resource Strategies. She serves as an advisor to the Aspen Institute for Education and Society program, and she served as a commissioner on the Equity and Excellence Commission for the U.S. Department of Education. And the way this is going to work is we're going to first have Michael present his analysis of the recently passed CARES Act and its effect on this financial situation. He's going to talk about that for a few minutes. Then Karen is going to have her turn. She's going to discuss what her organization's been working on, talking with school CFOs and district CFOs. Then we're going to do a Q&A with me that I lead. And finally, for the last 20 minutes or so, we're going to throw it to the audience for questions. So thanks very much for listening. Mike, if you are ready, could you present your analysis?
Absolutely, thank you. My name is Michael Griffith. I'm a school finance consultant, soon to be a employee of the Learning Policy Institute. And if you can move to my next slide there, I can tell you, the CARES Act came at a time that we thought this would be a sufficient amount of money to help schools get past what they were looking at as an economic downturn. So potentially it provides $16.2 billion to K-12 systems. The bulk of this is through what's known as the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, which is a pretty long term, but what it essentially is a program that provides over $13 billion to K-12 education. 90% has to go directly to school districts. The other 10% can be used by governors as they see fit for K-12 programs. Governors can either distribute it out to all of their school districts equally, or they can choose to distribute those dollars out to specific school districts that they feel were disproportionately hit by the virus. The money is distributed out to school districts and to states based on their Title I Part A funding, and it's the proportion essentially of how much they receive from Title I Point A. There is a second fund just shy of $3 billion that can be used by governors either for K-12 or higher ed. It is their discretion to choose which, and they can distribute those dollars again essentially as they see fit. So a governor could choose to give it all to a couple of universities. Governor could choose to give it all to K-12. We did a quick analysis, and if you can move to the next slide, and some of you might have seen my analysis covered in Education Week, that we're estimating that governors will provide half of the money, there's a discretionary $3 billion to K-12, the other half to higher education. This would mean about $286 per student going to public K-12 education systems. And what that means is about 2% of total education spending would come from this funding. So it is helpful, but a 2% boost is not going to be sufficient enough to kind of get us past this downturn. And it ranges from state to state, depending on what state you're in. It only equates to about 1% of funding in Connecticut, where it equates to about 3.8% of funding in Mississippi. That has to do with the fact that Connecticut's a very high spending state. Mississippi is always one of the lowest spending states on a per pupil basis. So federal dollars mean much more in a state like Mississippi than they do in a state like Connecticut. If you can go to the next slide. Really, at this point, we do not know how the pandemic will impact state education budgets. If you would have asked me this a month ago, I would have said in the 5% range. Even last week, I was hearing in sort of the 10%, maybe 15% range. Now I'm hearing states that are talking about a 30% cut. That's really unheard of. To put this into perspective, the revenue cuts we saw in education from states during the last recession were about 7.5%. So this is a four times the impact of the last economic downturn. Because of this, because these numbers are coming in and it's looking so dramatic at this point, there is talk that the federal government will come up with a second federal bill for recovery just targeted towards education, or at least part of it targeted towards education. And one of the numbers they're throwing out there is a $200 billion, it's billion with a B, stimulus for education, which would essentially put it at about 2.5 times what the Recovery Act funding was during the last recession. The numbers are showing that we're looking at that kind of an impact for education over a 3-year period. So that money would be quickly used by states and school districts. One thing to leave you off at least on a good note is we're not looking at a decrease in property taxes now, or at least for the next 2 years. Property values have not decreased, right? And even when they decrease, it takes about 1 year to 3 years for that to impact actual revenue for school districts. So it looks like we're at a pretty good place locally, and that's stable. It's just the state funding that we're really worried about. If you could go to my final slide, I think it just says Q&A, and we're going to do that later. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions that you have later on in this webinar.
Thank you, Michael. Now, Karen, if you're ready, can you go forward?
So I'm Karen Hawley-Miles, and I am the CEO and President of Education Resource Strategies. We are a national nonprofit that works deeply with school districts and schools around how they might organize their resources strategically to make sure that every child in every school has the learning they need. So the comments that I'm going to make really come from the deep work that we've been doing over now 15 years as an organization, but really spending the last month or so reaching out to try to understand what's going on there. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and sharing some of the anecdotes from that. So just briefly, we talk about a triple squeeze in the fall. So student needs going to increase even as districts are keeping on trying to reach higher learning standards. And as Michael said, there's going to be significant learning loss from this year's shutdown. There'll be social and emotional trauma that comes, and along with that, the impacts on need will be unequal across students and families and communities. And schools may need to plan for a temporary shutdown, which adds additional cost. The second thing is that revenue, as we just talked about, is going to be uncertain, way down at worst. One thing that folks may not know is that most of these states were already in kind of a crunch period before this happened. There was a group of states that were actually anticipating an increase in spend, and some of you may be on this from there. Maryland and Massachusetts and even Texas were putting significantly more resources into education, and now those states, particularly Texas, are going to be suffering a big downturn. So this is going to be a huge shift in what districts are going to have to plan for. And then finally, spending needs are going to increase significantly, especially if there aren't changes to the underlying structures. Even before the needs that I outlined in that first bullet, salaries go up each year by about 2 to 3%, benefits costs increase, pensions costs increase, special ed costs continue to rise. And so we're looking at, districts always have to figure out how to do cuts and do balanced budgets even before this starts. And so here's what we're facing. You might think that because the schools are closed, for a quarter of the year, some even a third of the year, that districts would be able to save a lot of money. But Rick, if you go to the next slide, unfortunately, districts aren't going to save that much from this year's school closure. We're in the middle of working on this, and so I'm hoping that you, if you're interested in this, we'll go to our website. We'll have much more updated numbers. But just as Michael was sharing, we're in this moment now where Nobody knows what's going to happen. We're just having to figure out how to plan for uncertainty, and we know that that uncertainty will continue for a period of time. But unfortunately, as I said, districts won't save much from this year's closure. Believe it or not, early estimates range from about 1% to 4% of that operating budget. We did some numbers, a couple of them were getting up around 6 or 7% of the operating budget, and a lot of that depends on the specific contractual arrangements that districts have and how flexible they feel about releasing folks from working. But most districts are continuing to pay staff. Many still paying part-time and hourly workers, because so many of these districts know that they are the major employers in their cities. And so, and also many of them are parents of the students in their schools. And so it has this huge ripple effect in terms of thinking about that. So on the left-hand side, you can see here possible areas of savings. And so, you know, districts are working hard to sock as much as they possibly can away from all of these different things. Hiring freezes, you can see no more hiring, no more vacant, you know, no more not filling vacancies. You know, some districts use an awful lot of outside contractors. They might stop paying those folks or delay those contracts because the service won't be able to be provided, and those kinds of things. Substitutes, utilities, and supplies and equipments are usually the big dollar items. Even student transportation, sometimes that's contracted, and it's hard to get out of those as well. In terms of new expenditures, you can see on that chart, food service delivery, many districts are actually expanding the numbers of people that they're serving, including families in their service delivery. They're having to pay folks overtime to do that. Obviously, technology and distance learning is adding a new sets of costs and so on. So if we go to the next slide, Rick. I don't need to go through this. It will be in the packet. Lori said you will get that. My basic point here is that the impact's going to vary widely over budgets. Places like Oklahoma and Texas, they're going to be devastated because of the oil as well as all the other things that they have going on versus other states. And then the second big point that Michael also made is that this is looking to be a much more challenging situation than the Great Recession. So if we go to the next chart, we did learn a lot from that Great Recession about what districts tends to do when budgets drop by 7%. First of all, 7%, maybe it doesn't sound like a lot. It's a lot for a school district. If you think about the fact that salaries go up 2 to 3% a year, cutting 7% is way more than it necessarily sounds. So, and what we learned from the last time around, and this is from a Bellwether education report that did a deep look at what happened with stimulus funding back then, is that typically districts use the extra money to go back to the way it used to be, to backfill state and local budget cuts, preserve program services and jobs. And which is not a bad thing, but as we'll talk about, it's which jobs are you preserving and are we preserving the right jobs as we move forward. Federal and state policy spending needs to be crafted with the goal of helping districts make tough choices to address the cost structures that were unsustainable even before we got into this, rather than simply postpone the tough decisions. We sort of talk about making the pain of this worth it by moving towards something that's potentially better for kids and better for teachers, and feel like this is a super valuable role that advocacy organizations and the media can play in helping build the understanding about what's driving ever increasing costs in school districts that don't actually always match the needs of kids today and the lessons that we have about how we should organize to accelerate student learning. If you go to the next slide, and I'll be quick about this, districts that took a more strategic approach did invest some of those dollars in ways that address needs in new ways, focusing on protecting the right jobs, directing dollars to pay some teachers more for greater expertise, strategically raising class sizes in some subjects and grades in order to support teacher teaming, and so on. If you go to the next chart, because I do want to leave plenty of time for questions, it's pretty obvious that this fall we're going to be in a place where we can't afford to do school the same way. because we're going to need to invest in all of these things. There's going to be a moment where we need to assess every student's learning and social and emotional needs after not being in school, in many cases for 6 months. We're going to need to re-engage students in in-person schooling to support attendance and meet immediate needs. Think of all those students who are moving into middle school or high school or even college without having finished their year and gone through the traditional transitional kinds of things. And there'll be a whole lot of work that will have to happen around supporting students around unfinished needs and designing ways for that to happen and to meet the social emotional needs that they have. We'll also need to design and scale professional learning for teachers and staff to ensure strong implementation of these new learning models and new technology. We're hearing reports from superintendents and chief academic officers in the field about just really exciting things going on with distance learning, but also incredibly uneven implementation across districts, across classrooms in schools, and across schools. And so getting this to a place where it can be scalable is going to be super important. So if we go to the next chart, and my last chart, it really raises the urgency for some key shifts in resources that strong schools already employ and have been for the last decade. These are things like rethinking rigid class sizes and one-teacher classroom models, optimizing existing time, restructuring compensation so that we can pay teachers who are doing much more, taking on more responsibility and have greater expertise, much more, change up who does what, when, by exploring innovative ways of delivering an instruction, and explicitly addressing social emotional needs. These are all things that were important to do before this happened. They're so much more important now. And one of the things, if we can be looking for silver linings so early in this process, that this moment has made obvious is that we will have different models of providing education. There will be pockets of students and teachers who have gotten so much more comfortable using technology and distance learning. The fact that students come in with widely different needs and widely different progress was always true, and now it'll be explicit and out there with hopefully much more, many more models for how to adjust time and attention to support students in getting to those things. So in the midst of this, which will undoubtedly be a financial crisis and huge need for switching up how things are done, it could make some things more possible and more conceivable in terms of this happening. And then there are 2 more slides in here where I share a couple of resources that I would love for you to be able to get to. One of them, Lori, included in the pre-read, which is a tool that we have called Budget Hold'em for districts, which enables any group of folks to play around with choices and trade-offs and understand the cost implications and to some degree the student learning implications of those different things. One thing is super clear: we're not going to get to the kinds of reductions in spend that we may need to be making in some of these places by cutting across the board. We're going to have to really think creatively and also think about what we no longer need to be doing anymore, while we're adding many new things that we need to be doing. And then the last thing I'll highlight, if you can switch to the last slide, is that we have created a toolkit that is on our website as well that we will be adding to as we go along, and sharing results of the survey that we're doing and so on. So super excited to share more with you as we learn, and know that that we're all sort of trying to figure out what is this going to mean.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you, Michael, both of whom gave great presentations just now. I also want to lift the curtain back a little bit and thank EWA's own Rick Wilson, who has obviously performed some backstage technical wizardry that allowed us to have visual aids after all. So thank you, Rick, for MacGyvering a solution to our problem. Nevertheless, the folks at home still can't see that I put on a jacket for this, so I am a little miffed about that. So why don't we get into questions, because we're running a tad behind the time, so that we can still open it up to the audience in about 15 or 20 minutes. And the first question I have, perhaps Michael, you can start, but it's for both of you, is I want to know what journalists can learn from what information we've gathered about the effects of previous recessions, and most prominently the last recession, the Great Recession, and the effects that those downturns had on school and district budgets. What are the really important lessons that can be gleaned from what we effectively just got done living through, which started in 2008?
So this is Mike. I would say, one of the things for the public is when we talk about dollars and budgets or percentages, and that doesn't really mean much to them, and what they understand is when we start talking about what is it going to mean for kids in schools and what are we talking about for positions. I did an analysis during the last recession of the number of teaching positions that could potentially be lost, and that really rang a bell for people. They could put their head around that. So when we talk about a 10% budget cut, that doesn't mean much until I say a 10% budget cut. My initial estimates is 270,000 teaching positions that could be lost in this country. And then you can take that down to what does that mean for the number of teaching positions in your state or your school district. When we talk about programs that are eliminated, when we talk about, things like kids now having to walk 2 miles to school because busing has been reduced, that kind of stuff people understand. I think we didn't do enough of that during the last recession at the beginning. And then once we kind of it dawned on us in the public that do public policy to kind of do more of that. That being said, I'm going to make my analysis public in about a week. So you can take a look at what a budget cut would mean for a number of lost teaching positions in your state.
Thank you, Michael. What about you, Karen?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Michael. I really love it. And I would say that I would just add to that, thinking about what equivalent trade-offs are in terms of, percents and also choices and trade-offs. So for example, you could spend 5%, raise everybody's salaries by 5% or reduce everybody's salaries by 5%, or you could, like 5% of salaries is enabling having to cut 2 full grades of schooling. So really making clear what those choices and trade-offs are. One other thing I want to say is that last time in almost every economic downturn, what happens is that we cut jobs. And then when the money comes back, we add jobs, we add them back. And so the result of that has actually been over time, we've continued to add back staff, but salaries for teachers have stayed pretty much flat, adjusted for inflation since over the last 20 years. And so the result of this is quite huge because it has made teaching a less attractive profession relative to others over time. And we are paying the price of that, especially in our districts that have the highest needs. And so one of the important questions to be asking as we think about this is, can we use this moment also as a way to think both about how many and which jobs we need and how much we're paying folks when we're bringing them back, and not just follow the same old patterns.
Karen, next one's, I'd like to start with you because you mentioned in your presentation that it's going to be hard to know what the fiscal effects of this shutdown and how they're going to shake out. Some states are going to be differentially impacted, clearly. You mentioned the example of Texas losing oil revenue. So there's sort of a double whammy there. The way I'm reading this is that states also distribute education spending totally differently. And they've got varied school funding mechanisms. Partially, that's a result of these state reforms that were put in place because of existing funding inequities. High dollar districts were getting a lot of local funding from property taxes, so it was evened out at the state level by dispensing income and sales taxes. So that since as I think you mentioned, Mike, local funding and local property, the local property tax base should be pretty stable over the next few years. That means that it's really going to be the state that's affected, and states that allocate more money at the state level to high poverty districts are going to see bigger hits. So, Karen, can you dig into that a little bit about the way this this recession is going to kind of ripple unevenly across different states?
Yeah, that's so right. Yeah, so the percent that in states that comes from property taxes ranges from about what I want to say, it ranges from about like from property taxes from like 40 to 60%. Is that right, Mike? So that it's a pretty big range, and so Connecticut, for example, depends a lot on property taxes, and so that's why you have such wide inequity across districts in terms of that. So that's going to be a big deal for districts in Connecticut, because the high needs districts are reliant on that state aid. And even though most states still don't weight dollars significantly by poverty, those districts rely hugely on it. And that's going to happen, Kevin, also. These are the places where the student need is going to go up so dramatically, and the poverty is going to increase even more. So we're going to have kind of a double whammy for those places. One thing I want to call out here that I think also reporters can be asking questions about, this is a big opportunity to leverage state scale, the scale of a state, or actually even share across districts. We are seeing in some across districts a lot more sharing of, even early on, sharing of actual curriculum material and teaching. So for example, in Los Angeles, they have a television station and are broadcasting lessons by grade, by subject, that are open to local districts, all of the surrounding areas. So there is an opportunity here for states to get in there and support at scale some of the learning needs that students will have here, especially in the highest needs districts.
Mike, anything to add?
No, I think that Karen made a good point, and you can look at the differences in states, and it's staggering sometimes how much one relies on local funding versus state funding. There are two districts that are both island districts in Ohio. One of them gets 95% of their funding from state resources. The other gets 95% of their funding from local resources. The local resource school district, which is the Put-in-Bay district, will get through this okay. They're not as reliant, and you can have a big cut in state funding and they're still going to be okay. The other district that's 95% reliant on state funding will be devastated by something like this. And so states need to take that into account. As Karen said, don't just cut 10% across the board. Make cuts that are based on a district's wealth and their student needs. We didn't see that very often during the last recession, and quite frankly, we haven't seen that during the last recession, the downturn of the early 80s and the downturn of the early 90s. So, hopefully we will not see what we saw in the last couple of downturns, is at the end, the increase in the gap between the wealthy districts and the poor districts.
Okay, as a corollary to that, I want to bring up the relative position in state budgets of education as a whole, because education, K-12 education, is occurring within a big portfolio of line items, if I can mix metaphors, in state budgets. I mean, it's competing, among other things, with higher education, where we also saw a lot of funding cut during the Great Recession, but also schools, all manner of social services for which law enforcement, trash pickup, welfare programs, for which need is also going to go up over the next couple of months and possibly the next couple of years. So while K-12 education is often the biggest individual thing that states spend on, there are competing priorities as well. So can I ask, how are states going to balance those priorities? Either Karen or Mike.
Karen, do you want to go first, or I can go?
Well, no, Mike, so I was interested that you had forecast that they would put 50% of the stimulus funding into education. Because our thought was that right now there's a Maslow's hierarchy, right? Is that it's perfectly right that the extra dollars need to be going toward, health and safety and all of that right now. And so part of what makes this so challenging is that we don't know how long this is going to go and how much more it's going to suck up on the health and safety side to sort of know how free states are going to be to put these dollars into education. So that's my worry here. What do you have insight on that one, Mike?
I can only tell you what happened during the last recession, and it tends to happen is actually K-12 is a little more insulated than some of the other budget line items. In most states, K-12 funding is either the largest or the second largest line item. In the states that it is the second largest, it's healthcare, mainly Medicare, that is the largest. And those two items tend to be insulated. You look at programs like higher ed that will take the brunt of the cuts in some of these states. The feeling is higher ed has the ability to raise tuition. They have an alternative revenue source. And so, they'll be able to tap that. We saw in the last downturn, and we've seen it in each of the downturns, that things like capital spending, especially roads, take a huge hit because the feeling is that can be done later.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we tend to see that it's either cuts or de-emphasizing social welfare programs. Some of this, quite frankly, just gets down to politics. The one thing that every state legislator in this country has in common is they all have a school district in their area. They don't all have a university. They don't all have some of these other programs, but they all have a school district. And so that tends to win the day. That doesn't mean K-12 doesn't take cuts. It doesn't mean that there aren't some states that chose, to kind of emphasize cuts in K-12. Just in general, it tended to be a little more insulated than other line items.
I'd like to get into one or two questions right before we go to audience Q&A about where reporters should be on this over the next couple of months and what we should be expecting. So, Karen, maybe you can start with this question. How should reporters be approaching our interviews with state leaders, budgetary leaders at the state level, and folks at the district level, school district leaders, superintendents, about how they're going to be approaching these imminent hits to revenue and almost inevitable budget cuts? What kinds of questions should we be asking?
Yeah. I would want to be asking a question almost that you teed up, Kevin, which is to say, how are we using this moment to think differently about the areas that we both need to invest in, both because we have a whole new set of needs and also because most of these districts are already pursuing and have a set of investments that they've been making over a period of years. So how are they approaching this moment to prioritize student needs and the investments that they may need to be making to continue to meet those needs, and do some of the kind of addressing the structural costs that they've been needing to address along the way. And the media has an opportunity to raise some of these sacred cows about pension and about benefit, and even about in districts that have still too many schools to be feasible. I mean, it's not right that right now is the time to close a bunch of schools. We just finished closing schools for the end of the year. This is not the time for that, but beginning to lay the groundwork for thinking differently about spending. So that would be thinking differently about how we do that and not doing the typical across the board sorts of cuts. And then there's one other thing I'm hoping that reporters can begin to do. We're learning a lot of great things and a lot of negative things about distance learning right now. And there's huge inequity across districts and across states, and even within districts in sort of access to technology, engagement with it, support from teachers, and all of those different things. This seems like an incredible time to be writing stories about this, collecting data to try to understand what's working and not, and to begin to find bright spots around that. And then the last thing I would want to be asking state leaders is, what are they doing to incentivize smart reductions to help districts prioritize investment in greater student needs, increase district purchasing power, make time, more flexible so we can do lots of different things in terms of helping kids catch up, and those sorts of questions.
Mike, just one last one for you, and that is, we're living in a world where there's another shoe dropping at least every week, and sometimes more often than that. And I'd like to know, on behalf of reporters, what kind of timeline should we be considering as we're waiting to figure out the impact of this downturn? What kind of milestones should we probably be looking out for? Obviously, there's the passage of further federal stimulus. Maybe there's budget negotiations for next year. And on what timeline should we be anticipating some of these issues are going to be hashed out?
So normally we would say, July 1st is a very big day. That's the first day of the next fiscal year in almost every state. That's when states do their projections and say, what did we bring in the previous year? That's going to still be a big date, but I would say in a lot of your states, they're going to start doing projections between now and then. That's kind of unusual for them, but they're trying to get a handle on what's happening. So I would really kind of put a marker on that July 1st date, but I would look for your states to see what their projections are between now and then. They're like everyone else. They are really struggling at the state level to figure out what this means. And so what it also is creating as an issue is some states pass their budgets based on budget estimates that were made in January. Those budget estimate numbers that were made in January now just are no longer any good. What that means then is some states are going to have to come back in the fall and correct their budgets. So you might be thinking, as if you're running a school district or you're reporting on it, that we're okay because the budget says we have this amount of money. That amount of money doesn't exist now, and that's true in all 50 states. What the extent that you're going to be hit is going to vary, but for everyone, we're looking at a downturn. Knowing this, realizing this, and trying to figure out and trying to contact the people in your state who can tell you how much of a hit it's going to be. It's going to be very important in the coming months.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is the moment you guys have been waiting for. We're going to start putting forward the very long list, Lori Crouch assures me, of audience questions that have come up over the last couple of minutes for our presenters. And I've also heard that we have a quick reprieve to go a little past 3 o'clock. So Lori, if you want to start up.
Thanks, Kevin. We have a question from Amy Pollocky asking about property taxes. We talked about how stable property taxes are right now, and there's a delayed effect in declines of property taxes. So she was wondering what kind of impact a large number of defaults or delayed payments would have on school budgets.
So this is Mike, I'm going to assume that one's towards me. What will happen, even if we start to see those defaults happen, is they won't show up on property rolls for at least another year. And depending on how your state assesses property, it won't show up for 3 years. So even though we had one of the worst property crises in our country during the last recession, property tax revenue actually went up each year for the first 3 years of the recession. that goes against what everyone would think. Even when it came down, which was starting in year 4 and year 5, it was still above what it was during the economic downturn. There's a lot of reasons for that, but really just to let you know, property tax revenue is stable even during bad times, and even when when people have to have foreclosures on their homes and have to default on loans.
Okay, question from Janelle Redka of the Yakima Herald Republic for Michael. In regard to state funding reductions, where should we be looking to monitor these potential reduction rates? And how do we find out if our state is going to have something like a 30% cut?
First, people you want to go to is in your State Department of Treasury. Sometimes it has different names in different states, but that's essentially who you want to go to. Legislators have their own people, so there's usually a legislative finance staff. You'd want to talk to them and see what they're hearing and what they're picking up. In some states, quite frankly, they just don't know, and they're waiting on sales tax revenue data. So sales taxes started to go down first, and we started to see that at the end of February. Projections are we're going to see a big decrease in March and an even larger one in April. The March and April numbers won't come in for maybe a month and a half. So they're just kind of waiting on those numbers. They might have, and they should have in a lot of your states, the February numbers at this point. Then what's going to trail that will be income tax numbers. That was made even more difficult by the fact that the federal government pushed back the tax date, because it's going to screw with your income tax revenue and when it comes in and how it comes in. But that should all be known basically by July 1st about what was your revenue during the end of the year. So, I'd reach out to, sometimes it's called Department of Management and Budget, sometimes it's the Treasury, but those are the people who will really know. Everybody else is sort of guessing.
Great, thanks. And I think this question is for Karen from John Fensterwald of EdSource. In the last recession, did some unions agree to forego step and column raises for fewer layoffs?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, some unions did agree to that. I mean, in fact, freezing compensation is a pretty typical solution. And to avoid, furloughs and layoffs, and it's kind of a main negotiating strategy, which makes short-term sense. And then the challenge is for teachers is that often those don't get then restored, at that next level, because the dollars don't come back very quickly. So yes, it's a typical negotiating strategy.
Okay. The next question is from Jacqueline Rabe Thomas of the New Haven Independent. She's asking about the federal education stabilization funds, is whether states are going to have the ability to require this additional funding to be used to supplement programs that already existed before the pandemic, rather than just being used to close budget gaps. Basically, how realistic is it to believe that the federal funding will be used on new programs and services versus just closing budget holes and letting local municipalities off the hook for level funded education? Any takers?
I'll take a stab at it, and then Karen, if you think I'm wrong or you've got something else. But really what it is, and we heard this discussion in the downturn back in 2008, 2009, that there was all this belief that this is extra money that states could do and districts could do some extra things with it. It really isn't going to be that. When we're talking about $280 per kid, and again, you're going to get that based on your Title I funding, and that's going to be distributed directly to districts. So more of it will be going to low income districts than high income. So when we say 280, that's not across the board. It's going to be different depending on how many low income kids you have in your school district. The places that have a high percentage of low income kids are going to need this money to close their funding gaps. There are all sorts of things that you can use the money for, but essentially the very last one, I think it's number 12, and it says you can use this money to fill any funding gaps that you have for current programs. And I think that's what we're going to see the vast majority of it going for, just simply getting them through the end of this year and the beginning of next year as school districts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think we want to be realistic, like just thinking about all the things that need to be accomplished between now and the beginning of next year. But hearkening back to the question that was asked previously about, you know, freezing salaries versus laying folks off, this is going to open up a question about who does what when in schools. And it's not necessarily true that we need to necessarily add back all of the same jobs and positions that we might need to cut in the short period of time. And so thinking strategically about, you know, can we significantly lower class sizes in some of the core subject areas and not so much in some other subject areas, thinking strategically about which grades, thinking about how you might organize instruction at scale for certain pieces of it, and involve other organizations or outside folks to do more individual coaching and things like that. Those things are going to be possible. And we're going to be starting to test out some of those with some of the strategies that districts need to spend money on this fall. So we're going to have to figure out how to provide expert tutoring. We're going to have to figure out how to do more distance learning, and thinking about how we add that to the mix here and change up, again, the numbers and types of jobs, I think is an important next step after, as Michael said, we get through this restart and opening of schools.
Okay, we have a question from Robbie Korth of State Impact, Oklahoma. I have a question about the governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. What sort of restrictions are on those block grants, and how have governors been directed to spend them? Are they required to work with the state departments of ed to make those decisions? Michael, would you know that answer?
So I've read through the legislation. I know the feds are still working on some guidelines, but essentially the legislation says it's the governor's decision, and the governor can choose how they'd like to distribute those dollars. I believe there might be, I did see some like recommendation that they work with, you know, other groups within the state, but it's going to come down to the governor can decide. Now, like I said, they're working pretty quickly at the federal level on the exact guidelines, but my understanding is, yeah, it's going to be their decision to decide, does it go K-12, does it go higher ed, and then how does it get distributed from there?
Okay, from Erica Meltzer of Chalk Peak, Colorado. My understanding is this round of federal funding has some restrictions that it cannot be used for backfill. How will that interact with the looming budget crisis at the state level? And will we see widespread waivers and scrapping of this requirement?
So I've got the 12 things you're allowed to spend it on. And again, this is the exact wording from the legislation. Number 12 is other activities that are necessary to maintain the operations of and continuity of services and local education agencies, and to continue employing existing staff and personnel. So that means they can use these funds to help close out and fill budgetary holes. Now, at the beginning, all the language is about using it for things like, you know, fighting the virus or online learning, and so they could use it for that also. But if they chose, they could use these funds, you know, to close the budget gaps.
Okay, let's see.
Can I add really quickly to that? One thing that's so interesting here is the timing, right? Because some of these districts aren't right now going to be in huge financial difficulty. They're going to be able to sock some money away. They had a little surplus. The big revenue hit doesn't come till 21, 22, too, the next school year. And so it is going to be interesting whether some of these dollars could be used in, responding to education recovery kinds of needs and social emotional needs, and really experimenting. So I would really want to try to understand that and what's playing out there in your state.
Okay. Deidre Smith, who's an education consultant based in Denver, asked whether you all see the role of philanthropy making up for some of these funding reductions.
So I can jump in. There's no possible way that the philanthropy could make up for these reductions. What I would say, though, is that in the superintendents that I've talked with, that many of them are feeling inspired, supported, incredibly amazed at the philanthropic support they've gotten short-term to respond to feeding students, getting the technology out, all these short-term needs. It's been really quite huge in many places. And philanthropy can play a huge role in this whole thing that I've been emphasizing here in sort of supporting districts to think about, first we've got to go through the re-entry process of getting school started, then we've got to go through recovery, and then we've got to get to a new normal. And what is that new normal? And I think philanthropy can be doing some work around, supporting what that looks like and supporting new ways of supporting kids to catch up and those kinds of things. And that part can be huge.
Yeah, and to put it in perspective, you're right. The little things they can be very helpful on, but essentially about a 7% cut in state funding would drain every dollar out of the Gates Foundation. And they're the largest foundation by far in the field. So it really is a thing where they can help on the edges and they can help with programs, especially for needy kids, but they can't, that kind of funding just can't fill the gaps.
Okay, and a final question from Erica Meltzer. You talked about rethinking how districts spend money. I think this is for you, Karen, in this time. What are the main areas you think there is overspending? I assume pensions is one, but what else?
Mm-hmm. Pensions is one, and we got to tackle that across the whole public sector. So we think there are a number, and I wouldn't use the term overspending necessarily. I would say that the structure of the way things are spent doesn't match what we need to do now. So, for example, we pay teachers using a step and lane structure that doesn't allow wide variation or teachers to play leadership roles. It doesn't get teachers up to professional levels of salary. We need to change that up. And so it's not that we don't spend enough on it. It's not that we're overspending on it. We need to change the way we spend those dollars and in fact probably spend more, which means I think we need to have fewer people in schools and we need to think differently about who does what, when we need small groups, when we can use larger groups, when we can use technology. So the second big place is what do school staffing schedules actually look like? And are there different models for doing that? The third is often we don't have the right school footprints, the numbers and types of schools in districts, because those are based on history. Special ed is a big area of spending that often doesn't match the way that it would best be used. So those are some examples, and we have a bunch in our toolkit that you could look at, and I'd be happy to talk further with you about that, Erica.
Okay, Kevin, do you have any additional questions based on what you've heard?
I had one remaining question, which I hope one or both of our panelists can speak to, which is just this. It's actually been over 10 years since the advent of the Great Recession. And one issue that came up in an article I wrote was that the financial staff in a lot of school districts, the comptrollers, the CFOs, these are not the same people in many instances as were in those posts 12 and 13 years ago. Many of them have only had the experience of allocating funding during times when when revenues were recovering from a big downturn. And I'm wondering if state education departments, school districts that you, Karen, and Mike have spoken to, if they're ready, if they're asking the necessary questions around what could happen here if the projections are as bad as they seem. So maybe we could talk to Karen first.
Yes, I think that's such a good question, Kevin. There are folks that have been around for this whole time. In fact, some of the CFOs that are cited in that bellwether report are still around. Sheila Shirley in Charlotte Mecklenburg has been through this many times, and so on. But you are right. In large part, this is feeling new to folks, especially in places like I just said that we're planning for an increase. The piece that's not new is every year they do this kind of cutting. The danger is that the way they do this cutting is they basically send out to every department and say, show me how you can cut 1 or 2% this year, and then give me a scenario that cuts 4 or 5. And so it all happens in this very siloed way. And so the question you're asking, Kevin, is how do we break through that? And what are the supports required to begin to do that? And are states organized to support that? I don't know of any states that are necessarily organized to support that kind of shift in spending. I do know that in Texas, they're doing quite a bit of work to try to incentivize innovation around a number of different things like expanded time, like master teachers and so on. And so they've been adding new money to that, to challenge to those areas to incentivize very different ways of working. The challenge is how do we do that in the context of also making budget cuts? And I just would say that this is just a huge need right now. And we're working really hard to try to bring folks together from the field to talk about this and try to raise the awareness that we've got to work on this. Really, quite frankly, Kevin, right now we're so much in the moment of figuring out still what we're going to do to support kids who are supposed to be in school right now. And usually this time of year, they're devoting all their time to thinking about next year. Right now, they're not there. They're thinking about right now, what are we going to do?
Right, that's concerning. Any last thoughts on that, Mike?
The only thing I'd add, and I agree with everything Karen said, is because of term limits, we have a whole new set of legislators in almost every state. So the legislators, obviously governors, because of term limits, a lot of these people have not dealt with this before. They weren't around during the last downturn, or at least in the positions that they are now. So we're missing it, kind of that institutional knowledge at the state level about as much as we are at the district level. And one of the key, I think, things that we learned is when the Recovery Act came in last time and provided extra federal dollars to education, you could spend it over 1 year, but you could also spread it out over 3. Those places that spread it out over 3 years did much better. They didn't face a cliff. Those who spent all their money in year 1 to make sure nothing bad happened faced a much more difficult year 2 and year 3. And in all honesty, we're looking at probably 3 tough years coming up. Hopefully year 2 and year 3 won't be as bad as year 1, but we could be looking at that. So knowing that and having that institutional knowledge of that this isn't a one-off thing and it's a 1-year thing, it's going to be kind of bad for a while.
Okay.
On that bright note.
We'll get through it. We'll be good.
Well, with that, I want to thank our guests, Michael Griffith, Karen Holly Miles, and Kevin Mankin. And I'd like to thank today's attendees and EWA members for participating. As soon as the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps us improve. And finally, visit ewa.org/events to sign up for upcoming online and hopefully in the not too distant future in-person seminars. Thanks and have a great day.